Okay, so we will get started. First, we're going to review the agenda that was sent out in everybody's packets. And first, want to open the floor to the public. If anybody from public has a comment on the agenda, which I don't think I'm seeing anybody from the public
You
here
know
right
what
now.
I would love? I'm here with Dan,
Yes.
brand new contracted employee. And I don't know anybody, so if we could do
We can do
introductions.
introductions.
Let's go around and do introductions. We
Yeah.
don't typically, but I would love to do that because I'm so grateful that you came here to do this presentation. So absolutely. My name is Melinda White and I chair the Police Advisory Board.
Okay.
I'm Jamie Pinkham, and I'm the Vice Chair of the Police Advisory Board.
Great. And I'm Dan Toll, Park Advisors.
Lisa Ewald, peer advocate.
I'm John Nichols, a member of the Police Advisory Board.
Danielle Mitchell, a member of the Police Advisory Board.
Tom Benton, same.
Angela Bernard, I'm the city minute taker.
Morris Lamont, St. Albans Police Department.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely, thank you.
Linda, I do have one question for you, sorry to interrupt, but two people I sent the link to said they're asking for a password.
Okay.
Two separate people are asking for that.
Pulling it in now.
They said they typed in a meeting ID and it's following it up with what is the password.
Doesn't show a password.
No, it doesn't.
Did you send it to my email address?
Yeah, the original, it shouldn't be requiring a password.
Okay.
It should be just the meeting ID, the 886 805 46689.
I'll be reading.
All right, and then, do the board members have any questions, revisions on the agenda? Not? So the next agenda item is mission review. Yes, Jamie, read it.
Can I interrupt real quick? There is actually a password and it says that it's, I think alpaca.
Oh, is it?
Yeah,
I don't see it on my, okay, thank you.
I was just reviewing the minutes.
Because I don't see it on my Zoom at all. Thank you so much for that.
Oh, actually, you know what? That might have been actually in the minutes for the
Community
meeting.
partnership, that's what I was going to
Partnership.
say, because I knew it was the one for the partnerships, but
Okay.
I don't remember P.E.G ever having a password.
Sorry about that.
That's all
Oh,
right.
I think-
All right, so
I
I'll
know I'm
have
crazy,
Jamie
but
read the
not
mission.
that crazy.
Our mission, the Police Advisory Board mission is to offer advice to the St. Albans Police Department for the successful implementation of the 21st century policing strategies and to assist the police department in following the established roadmap as amended by the City Council.
Thank you, Jamie. Okay, and still keeping an eye on Zoom, I don't see anybody coming in yet. Okay, so the next agenda item was to consider approval of the September and October meeting minutes. So last month, we didn't have a quorum to vote on the September minutes, so those were sent out in the packets. And I want to open the floor if any members saw any discrepancies in any of those minutes. And if not, I would entertain a motion to accept.
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
All right.
Any opposed? Okay, motion passed. So recommendations for city council in our last meeting, and it seems actually a little quirky that we ended up moving this to the front of the agenda because we're going to learn a lot more about some other options. But just want to keep our board focused on having a clear, defined outline of what we're asking from city council. So we're going to be joining their meeting in December, asking for some support in getting additional positions to be embedded with law enforcement. So far, we've looked at specifically the embedded crisis worker, which has been wonderful to learn more about. And then there were also some other thoughts that had come up. So I don't think right now is the time to say, let's get those clearly decided. But what I'd love to do is either go in executive session later, or have you email me with your ideas. I know some people have emailed what they thought would be a good idea, but just so we can be more prepared before the city council meeting. So to just kind of try to get a deadline on that before the meeting, and I'll send out an email as well.
Melinda, it may make sense for us to do the executive session tonight if time allows, because we're going to be hearing so much great information while we have everyone here.
That's my preference.
If we can do that.
And are board members comfortable with that? Are you able and willing to stay a little bit after? Beautiful, thank you so much for that. Okay, so the next piece, I'll let Jeannie go over the surveys.
So, no, you're fine. Just a very quick update. Last month we talked that the surveys were about to be deployed. They have been mailed to every resident in St. Albans City. And hopefully people have begun returning them. We'll follow up with Kristen as we close out November into early December to get all of the results that have been submitted, and we'll plan to look over them and go over them as a group in December with the notion that we'll be able to share the data that we have in January is our target. We recognize that there are a couple opportunities for improvement with our survey process, and appreciate everybody's patience and grace as we get off the ground, but it's the first good attempt to get data, and then hopefully it will not be the last, so we'll continue to look at how we can deploy surveys to catch community pulse throughout our journey, and we will make sure we take what we learned and apply that next time, such as adding a welcome letter, applying a due date to them, and some of those logistical things that we overlooked this time. So if you haven't turned it in already, please do, and please encourage your friends and family to do so as well.
Thank you, Jamie. Any questions or comments? Okay, we'll move right along. So the next piece is the community partnership, and I just wanted to highlight one thing that happened recently for anybody who didn't see the post. There was a need for turkeys in our area, and police department put up a post on November 16th to support Martha's, and in less than 24 hours they had 20 turkeys, and I believe more were still being recruited. I was in a meeting today with Community Action. They have so many that they're running out of freezer space, which is like a humongous, wonderful problem to have. So just wanted to say thank you for that in the community work. And then also the Police Advisory Board, Chief Lamont and Sam presented at the Franklin Grand Isle Community Partnership in November. And that was very well received. The partners were extremely engaged, extremely interested in the work that we're doing. They're interested in the embedded crisis worker and the success of that, and then also looking for opportunities to partner more and grow. There are upwards of 52 different community partners on the listserv for the partnership. So that information was widely spread, and we're still getting comments and feedback and ideas about, we really want to find a way to partner so we have the appropriate resources answering the need in the community. So just want to say thank you for that. And then I'm going to move forward to the policy and procedure focus and give Jamie the floor for that for a moment.
Yeah, so there were quite a few policies for the board to look at. We know they came in a short turnaround time, but we did spend a lot of time looking at them over the last week in partnership with Chief. And so our hope was to kind of go through them as a batch in more like really more like a consent agenda format, but wanted to give anybody a chance to ask questions about any of them. So I will list them, and then Chief, jump in on anything that you want to add. We have arrest and investigatory stops, investigations, harassment and discrimination with LGBTQ specifications attached to them. So it's specific to harassing members of the LGBTQ community, or not, as it were. Sexual harassment in the workplace, transporting and searching prisoners, and then there was also the use of force statewide policy. That's really not for us to recommend approval to City Council for. That one, really not much that we can impact, but thought it was important for this group to understand what is in that policy and be able to ask Chief any questions about it. So, Chief, anything you want to add on any of those policies or?
Well, first of all, again, I appreciate Jamie and her team that looks at these because policies, as we always say, are monotonous and hard to read and hard to follow and hard to make suggestions on. Some of these, I kept the original date on the top of when I started submitting these. Some of these go back to July. You guys have been through so many policies for us. I think this is like number 22 or 23, I think in the end. So these are some of the ones that are important, as they all are, but they didn't rise to the level of all the ones that have taken preference to me to get to you to get done quicker. So these are ones that just kind of get pushed aside. So it's time to get these out and done. So that being said, Jamie and crew had made some suggestions this week. I made up the changes on the suggestions. So again, every suggestion you guys make has been good, and we made them happen. There's really nothing in here that's out of the ordinary from what these are. Most of them are standard policies that you would have in any workplace of any size. They're more or less human resource type policies. The investigation policy is something you wouldn't see other than the police department. This one, the investigation policy came out of a complaint we had against one of our officers, and it was a kind of a procedure type complaint. So this policy was a direct result of that, which unfortunately sometimes how policies go. Basically, the gist of this policy is just outlines how thoroughly you're going to do investigations. It follows some Act 56 language, which is the statute in the state of Vermont that describes in detail how thoroughly you're going to do an investigation, what happens if you don't. That's kind of where this investigation policy came from. The transportation and searching of prisoners. It's kind of the purpose behind this policy. It's a CLIA policy, as all of these are, but more or less to tell the officers how you're going to transport, how you're going to search the car and the holding cells before and after you transport to make sure that you're not missing contraband. What you're going to do in the case of an escape, who you're going to notify, and when you're going to do that. But again, it's a CLIA policy. The harassment policies are both more or less standard HR policies. The LGBTQ specification policy, that was a new CLIA policy. I say new, I think it's 2 years old now. That was the newest one I could find. It just goes in more detail of how you're going to treat people that are in that community, and some special circumstances you might want to think about, and how to, more or less how to talk to them, when you should be asking them, why you should be asking them, and how to take their feelings into consideration, how important that is. And this outlines that. Up to this point, we haven't had any issues where we've had complaints or anything, but this is trying to get ahead of that and just give people something to think about. And that's another side of policies. It's not just to as a result of a complaint, but it's also to get people thinking before a complaint comes in. And that was the goal behind this one. Arrest and investigatory stops. That's kind of on the forefront of the country right now. When can you stop people? Why you stop people? What you can do when you do stop people. This kind of outlines what a Terry pat down is, what a frisk is, why you stop people, what detention is, probable cause, reasonable suspicion. It's all stuff you're taught in the academy, but this outlines it again, more recent for people. It's a great policy. This I think changes quite frequently, but this policy was the most recent one I could find that's CLIA standard, and we wrote it out the best we could, and it seems to follow it. Use of force policy that we just spoke about for a second, meaning saying that it's a state policy, we can't change it. No, we can't. It's a very well-written policy. You guys have heard us talk about it 100 times that it was coming. Well, here it is. It came out in October. We had till October 1st to adopt it. Us and every agency in the state of Vermont did adopt it. It's a great policy. I encourage anybody who wants to see it to go on the state website, or I can give you a copy of ours. It's 33 pages, I believe it is, in length. Most of it, the reason it's so long is because there's a lot of definitions in it. But it's a good policy, and it's probably going to change every year, would be my guess, as the state changes with legislature input. But it's a good policy, and again, every state law enforcement agency is covered by the same policy now. So it puts us for a change. Everybody's working under the same parameters, so it's good.
And Chief, I think it's the investigatory stops
Yep.
one. I think there was an important section about ensuring the probable cause for, or the cause for in going forward with a stop. And it really talked about making sure that we don't do so based on color, gender identity. I think it's important for this group to maybe hear that and understand that that is written into policy.
So stops, there's non-custodial stops, meaning that you could be walking down the street and stop and have a conversation with somebody, that's a non-custodial conversation. You're legally within your rights as a police officer to do that. What Jamie's referring to is not stopping somebody or having a conversation with someone based solely on their gender, any bias that the officer may or may not have, and they shouldn't. And that goes along with fair and impartial policing policies, which we have, but this policy lists that right in there, that you can't stop somebody based on any discriminatory reasons or act upon any discriminatory bias. And that's in almost all these policies list that. Any place in here transporting prisoners to harassment, it's all listed in that when they can't act on any action can be taken based on any bias. And those are all spelled out, and that was one suggestion you would make. That wasn't spelled out directly in that policy.
Yeah, the language was so well worded, and I think it was that policy, and that we just wanted to make, my suggestion was that we crosswalked that language into the other policies, so that way there would be no confusion with that being the stance of the SAPD and so on and so forth.
So there's a statewide fair and impartial policing training that came out, started today, was the first. Every police officer in the state of Vermont has to go through the same fair and impartial training. Started today was day one. We sent 8 officers today. A quarter of our department went through it today. You have till I think it's May 30th to be through it. We'll be done by the end of next week. Hopefully, unless somebody gets sick or something. We have everybody scheduled really quick here. It's being held at South Burlington PD for whatever reason. They're the hub. But every single officer has to go through it. I went today. It was a good training. And it's a yearly training, but this is the first time the state hired a contractor to do it. She's a doctor out of UVM that's doing it. Yes, Mercedes Avila, and it was very good. She's from Argentina. She teaches us in the Guard, but her specialty is in neurological development, I believe. But this is her training she does for all the National Guard units. Like I said, the Department of Public Safety just hired her to do all this, and I thought it was worthwhile training. But it's going to be taught throughout the state.
So was there any communication by any other board members, any questions, comments? No, I would entertain a motion to accept the policies as written.
So moved. All right, make a motion to accept the policies.
Thank you, Diane.
Mhm.
Second?
A second.
Susie, please. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, same sign. Okay, the motion carries. So, moving on to the next piece, and before I do that, I just will mention there was a password for the Zoom, 031. I just emailed it to you.
Yep, you did.
So,
Thank you.
and it's the same link and password as historically was used, and I don't know why it wasn't pasted and included now. So my apologies for the many technical difficulties that have happened in this meeting for a change of location and whatnot. I apologize to the board and the public for any quirks that happen trying to reach everyone. So the next piece of our agenda is to introduce Dan Towell, who's a peer worker, and we're so extremely grateful that you are coming to share the presentation with us. We know there's huge value, and I just am super excited to hear you. So without further ado, I want to let you get started because I know there's a lot of...
Did we want to do that? There was the public comment that we wanted to do right
Before the presentation?
Right, didn't we?
I didn't have it until the end, but we...
Oh, no, it was that specific letter that we received.
Yes.
From an individual.
Yes, okay,
Sorry,
I apologize.
sorry.
So this is something I
Yes.
completely forgot when we were talking about the agenda. So Jamie and I actually do have one addition to the agenda that we wanted to include. Jamie was contacted by somebody in community and had a letter that she wanted to read, and it is so applicable to exactly what we're going to be hearing about in the presentation. So I apologize for that. We wanted to include that in the agenda. It was very last minute. Jamie, I'll let you.
But it aligns with this agenda item under the overview of the mental health peer worker. So it's a good introduction into what Dan, I think, is going to present to us. So we, I was approached by a member of the community who has chosen to remain anonymous to protect the privacy of their daughter, rightfully so. But this is the parent of a 12-year-old girl who is kind, smart, and a wonderful person inside and out. She has dealt with mental health ups and downs since about 3rd or 4th grade, and it has not been easy. As a parent, I have done everything to always get her the help that she needs, and I have reached out to as many resources as possible. We have been to her primary pediatrician, therapist, NCSS, and even short-term crisis inpatient facility in Burlington. My daughter deals with depression and anxiety and sometimes has very big meltdowns because she doesn't know how to deal with the intense emotions that come with depression or anxiety. After reaching out to so many resources, I've never felt like I have been heard or received the adequate help that was needed. Just from one resource alone, we received psychology services and family services, which are meant to get her out in the community and doing things to keep her busy. Within 6 months, both services failed, and we didn't get more than a few sessions out of each service during those 6 months. We have been through 3 therapists, all of which have failed her due to inconsistency. The school she was going to has also failed her. I went there multiple times because she was being bullied, and their school counselor made her sit in a room with the bully and talk it out. Throughout all this, my daughter has been suicidal at times. She's tried experimenting with self-harm and done other harmful things a few times. She's also become violent and physically abusive towards me at times, and there's nothing I can do because she is my child. So I stand there and I take it, or I try to walk away. Sometimes I admit that I am even scared of her when she's in that state, which is embarrassing and a hard thing to admit. In the last 2 years or so, I have called the crisis line at least a dozen or more times, all of which garnered me no help. As far as I know, the crisis line is the only resource in Franklin County when you are dealing with this type of situation. Before now, I was under the impression that when any human, no matter what age, was threatening suicide or harming others, that the police could come and help, or at least provide guidance. I have called the police at least 3 times in these last few years, and each time it was a situation where my daughter was threatening suicide or beating me up, and all I could do was stand there. I was told by the police that they do not deal with that and to call crisis. They did not seem to want to listen, and when I said that I had called crisis, it had already been 30 minutes and I didn't hear back from them yet. I begged for someone to just come and help me with the situation. I called the Vermont State Police once and was hung up on by the dispatcher. I was pleading with her that I just wanted to talk to an officer or something because I had already called crisis and received no assistance. I still have the recording of a conversation with the dispatcher, with the officer I spoke to, explain that they couldn't come out. And then they said, we can have an ambulance go there, but they probably won't want to go in without law enforcement there. But we can at least ask and see if they want to. I don't want to dissuade you from calling, but just understand that right now we really are going to need it to be life-threatening, which you tell me you've been kind of in and out of that state. That's in quotes. That was the conversation that was had with an officer. I explained that anytime I have called police, it was at that point of my daughter threatening her own life. In this example, I had called because my daughter possessed a knife from the kitchen and was threatening to kill herself. I was told after this that I should call police only if it was life-threatening situation and the dispatcher would let them know so they could decide. When I have called crisis about life-threatening situations or my daughter physically hurting me during these episodes, I was told to call the police. You can see how this would be frustrating because crisis is telling me to call the police and the police are telling me to call crisis. Meanwhile, my 12-year-old daughter is falling through the cracks. I can't stand by and watch this happen anymore. I can't stand by and watch her fall through the cracks. She deserves better. All of our children deserve better. These are not just children, they are future adults in our society. We have to have a better mental health system in place for our children. We cannot wait to get them help until something goes very wrong. It needs to be before we reach that point. My hope is that there will be more funding for NCSS so they can provide more help to the community. I also hope that the police and NCSS can work together and communicate for things like this. That way there is no confusion when someone is in real crisis. I hope that there can be a better solution than sending a kid in crisis to the hospital or trying to talk to them over the phone. These things have proven not to work. I hope that we can do better in the future. Thank you for listening. And so I had an opportunity to speak with this individual, and their goal was really, it's a very emotional story, and some challenges obviously that they faced in their journey with their child, but their goal was really to help us and hopefully with this presentation today, really come up with some meaningful solutions so that those situations can be better managed in the future for her daughter, for other children, for adults who find themselves in that situation. So her intention was to make sure that their story was heard, but also make sure that we make a step forward in recommending some reasonable solutions. So hopefully, I think that you're here today to give us that presentation, so thank you for allowing us the time to share that individual story. And
Sure, actually, you're right, that it actually is a very good anecdote to lead into my, my presentation. I do need to leave my mask on, correct?
We prefer it.
Okay, that's fine. You probably don't want to see my face anyway. A lot of people say that anyway. Well, without any further ado, since I do have a lot of material to try to cover here, I'll dive right in with the agenda. So what I'm here to talk to you about after a brief introduction is crisis response, background, future opportunity, what's going on here, and then the key success to building what I call a crisis response triad, and then a little bit more information about what we do, and then some sort of conceptual thoughts about a game plan. And so, so I'll get into some more detail later, but I'm Dan Toll. I'm the founder and president of Parker Advisor. We're a management consultancy, process improvement firm focused on mental health, specifically peer support, but also the intersection of mental health and law enforcement. So that's why I'm here. I'm planning, I have about an hour on the agenda. I'm planning on doing about 45-minute presentation and then Q&A, but if you do have, at the end, if you do have questions, feel free to interrupt. So we read that, don't have to say any more about the mission, which is wonderful to see. So first, to start with, I just want to sort of level set, crisis response in general, and talk a little bit about the United States, and then zone in on our wonderful home state here in Vermont. So in terms of the United States, you all have been meeting for about a year now?
Yep, about a year.
Yeah, and I actually, I have been on the Montpelier Police Review Board, your analog, and we just submitted our recommendations to the City Council in October. So,
I know, I said wonderful.
Yeah.
I'm so grateful you're here too with that
Yeah.
experience.
so it sounds like we've been on sort of a parallel track. So I may be covering material that you all know inside and out, but, just to make sure everybody's on the same page, bear with me. So, as I'm sure all of you are aware by now that the issue at the intersection of mental health and crisis response has become, the spotlight has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger, and the need for change just accelerates, even pre-COVID, but with COVID now, it's just, really opened Pandora's box even more than it was already open before. For example, as you probably know, a civilian encounter with police is 16 times more likely to result in a person's death if they have an untreated mental illness. So clearly this is a big issue. So what I thought I'd do, I just wanted to focus on a few examples of some leading practices here in the U.S. in some cities, just to give you some idea of things that are going on, some of which, again, you may be aware of, so I'll try to keep it brief. But, maybe I'll have you raise your hands. Is anybody familiar with what Eugene, Oregon's doing? Cahoots. Anybody? How about Austin or Sacramento? Is Sam here, by the way? Oh, I thought that was you. I didn't hear all the names. So you could come over here and give this presentation, or at least help me. I've heard such wonderful things about you. I read the last minute meetings. It sounds like lots of good things going on. Yeah, to start with Austin. Austin's, over the last year or so, has funded a community-run community response team. And what they do is they focus on situations that do not appear to require police response. For example, in their situation, according to the Austin Justice Center Coalition report that was released in July of last year regarding 911 calls, their data indicated that about 21% of the 911 calls actually pertain to crime. And they have formed what they call the 10,000 Fearless First Responders, which is it's basically a self-sufficient, autonomous, sustainable group of non-law enforcement first responders who can deal with crime and non-crime situations that are handled by police. Sacramento has what they call the Mental Health First program, which is led by community groups most impacted by police violence. And it's an independent crisis response service. It's staffed by actually peer support workers, and I'll talk to you more about that later, as well as other citizens who are trained in dealing with crisis situations. And they're specifically focused on de-escalating confrontations by providing direct aid and responses to those experiencing potentially life-threatening psychological and other instances of crisis. So this model actually was implemented in January of 2020, and it's implemented under the guidance of what's called the Anti-Police Terror Project. And so they initially rolled this out in Sacramento, and now subsequently Oakland is using the same model to do a similar type of initiative. And basically, the purpose of this program is to interrupt, and this is in quotes, it's quote, to interrupt and eliminate the need for law enforcement by providing mobile peer support, de-escalation assistance, and non-punitive and life-affirming interventions. Therefore, decriminalizing emotional and psychological crises and decreasing stigma around mental health, substance use, and domestic violence. And then lastly, the leading edge practice that most people are aware of in this realm is the CAHOOTS program out of Eugene, Oregon, which was implemented approximately 30 years ago. CAHOOTS, for those who don't know, stands for Crisis Assistance Helping Out on the Streets. I got it out this time. Every time it's dicey, but I'm going to get my tongue tied. But as many of you may be aware, basically it's a community policing alternative that's been responding to many 911 calls for years now. And this particular model that dispatchers route calls involving mental health to teams of medics and mental health workers. So the CAHOOTS model's been around a long time, and it really represents the leading practice of moving from simply law enforcement to respond to all crises, to introducing a different crisis response team that can augment law enforcement. In this case, it's medics and crisis workers. But what I'm going to talk to you today is what really is considered best practices: law enforcement, social worker, and peer response. Meanwhile, here in our lovely Green Mountain State, there are a number of things going on, as you're probably aware of. In Montpelier, Barrie, we have where I live in Montpelier, we have an embedded crisis worker. Have you met Susan?
Susan, she's great. Actually,
yeah, she splits time between, just like Sam, she splits time between Barrie and Montpelier, also Hartford, I understand, has embedded social workers. So there are a number, you probably know a lot more about the details of your colleagues across the state. So Vermont's really doing a lot of good things in terms of moving down that path towards, finding the appropriate resource to deal with the crisis as it is. Just a couple things about other things that are going on in Vermont. The Agency of Human Services has a $800,000 grant, and they've asked for proposals to set up a statewide mobile crisis response initiative. And a portion of that, there's a peer support crisis worker piece of that, and I'm the subject matter expert on one proposal. We submitted the proposal probably 3 weeks ago to AHS, and I may be overconfident, but I think we have a 90% chance of winning. We have the former commissioner of D&H, and this wonderful team of people, and a very thoughtful proposal. So, knock on wood, we'll get it. But essentially, what this crisis, this mobile crisis initiative will do over a 6-7 month period is look at everything that's going on in the state relative to crisis response. Embedded social workers, the pilot in Rutland, and put together a comprehensive plan as to what are we doing well and what we're doing better and what can we add to the program. And $800,000 to do a project like that, and at least the team that I'm part of, I know is very well qualified to put together a plan that hopefully will be moving our state sort of move forward, but without starting something new, which can happen at times where the legislature passes a bill and it just sort of layers on to things that exist. So I think that's a very exciting project that will be supposed to be starting in December. Meanwhile, as you also are probably aware, the Vermont State Police recently hired the former Deputy Commissioner of D&H, Morning Fox, to embed social workers in all the police barracks. That's a sort of initial charge that she's putting a lot of time and effort into now. But also he is looking to do exactly what we're talking about here as the next step. And so he and I sit on a number of statewide committees at DMH, and so actually know, his name is Morning Fox, but he goes by Fox. It's easier for people. So I've known him quite a while, and I'm delighted that he got that job because he's just a first-class individual and a very smart man. So that's a snapshot of what's going on here in Vermont. Next thing I'd like to turn to is future opportunities. And here's what I mentioned earlier. This is what I like to call the crisis response triad, the stool, the three-legged stool. And I'll be getting more and more into this during the presentation, but essentially, from the top level, it's really a team of law enforcement, social work, and peer support, working together for the optimal response.
Can I ask you one question? Are we
Sure.
going to have access to the PowerPoint after? Or is that something that can be shared or no? And if not, that's okay. I just want to take a picture of that before the slide goes on, if not.
I can share at least some of it with GP.
Okay.
It's a little bit proprietary, but yeah.
Thank you.
So really, the crisis response triad, the CRT, best practice is really at the intersection of these three components you see here. All right, so peer support. Are people in this room familiar with peer support? Do you have some? Okay. So I won't spend a whole lot of time talking about background relative to peer support, but I will sort of set a level regarding peer support, talk about crisis workers, and then the status here in the state. So Peers are, as many of you are aware, are individuals who are in recovery, who have lived mental health experience, that are at a position where they can go out and work with others to provide support in a whole variety of mental health related situations. They can help them with feelings of isolation and fear, build trust and relationship because they can connect with their shared experience. They can interact with experiencing crisis, dealing with feelings of fear and distrust, with fear and distrust that may have built up with other types of providers because of negative interactions that they've had. And essentially peer specialists, another term that's used, can inspire hope and demonstrate the possibility of recovery by being an example. SAMHSA, as you all may be aware, is the division under the Agency of Human Services at the federal level, Substance Abuse Mental Health and Services Agency. And as you can see here, SAMHSA itself has said that the availability of peer support is one of the principles necessary as part of 10 essential values to approach appropriate crisis response. So even our brethren at the federal level have come to the point where they've acknowledged that this really is an important component of crisis response. In terms of what is a peer support crisis worker, essentially peer support workers, and I actually myself have been a peer support worker. I facilitate peer support groups for National Alliance of Vermont, and also an operator for Pathways Vermont support line. And in both roles, I'm a peer support worker. I myself have a lived mental health experience, and I've reached a point in my recovery a number of years ago where I've been able to do this. And in the case of a peer support crisis worker, it's people who've been trained, people who are peers, people with lived experience, who are trained to deal with a crisis situation. So it involves more in-depth mental health training as well as law enforcement training and there are other elements to that training. So it's essentially taking the peer support model and applying it to this, into the world of crisis response. In terms of Vermont, there are cities that are starting to explore it. I can tell you specifically, and I'll show you a little bit later, that one of the recommendations that we made that the Montpelier Police Review Committee made 2 months, well, October, was regarding adding a peer support crisis worker, which the City Council has accepted conceptually. Now we get to the rubber meets the road in terms of working out the details. But other than that, as far as I'm aware, there's not a lot of programs in place right now. There are a lot of cities, like you folks obviously invited, Chief Moss invited me here. So there's a lot of interest and a lot of people who are looking to find out more about it. So, so in terms of the benefits of challenge and risk, first the benefits. Just to reinforce my earlier comments, a peer support crisis response can help eliminate the need for mental health enforcement when there are need for law enforcement when there's mental health crisis situation, providing things like peer support and de-escalation assistance, and then life-affirming interventions to help eliminate emotional crises and frankly to help deal with the issue of stigma for people not only with mental health conditions but substance use disorder and severe trauma situations. essentially, these models connect people who have mental health or substance use disorders with services before they intersect or enter into or connect with the criminal justice system. They support law enforcement in responding to both public safety and mental health crises. They enable diversion to treatment before arrest can take place. It reduces the pressure on local emergency departments and inpatient psychiatric facilities. And at the end of the day, what a peer support crisis worker can do is connect with the individual with shared experience, with mutuality, and be able to talk about their own experience in the context of the situation they're dealing with. And in the interest of time, I'll move right along. There's more I could say on this. But in terms of, so moving to the next, the benefits of implementing the collaborative best practice model, the medical community over the course of the 30 years that the CAHOOTS program has been in place has become more and more comfortable and then more supportive of this model of moving from just law enforcement to mental health specialists, social workers or peer support specialists. And just to give you, an example of the CAHOOTS program, which you may be aware of, Oregon taxpayers saved about $8.5 million a year in both police and emergency department funding, but also led to a significant decrease in police backup. Their data says that only 1% of cases involved police backup. So this model, what I call the CRT Triad, essentially partners the police officers with two different types of mental health specialties, the clinical social worker and then the trained peer support worker. And by having a person with lived experience, again, it can help cut down on higher cost and higher invasive types of activities, including going to the emergency room, which we all know across the country, including the state, can be a very traumatic experience. If we can avoid that, that's what we'd like to do at all costs. In terms of challenges of the peer support crisis worker model, it's very new. It's across the country and here in Vermont. And some of the issues that we are working on and faced are, just like in the mental health world, shortage of peer support workers. And in addition to workers, a management capacity to run this initiative. As I said earlier, and you're all aware, there's a lot of momentum now to move forward with this type of practice. So I'm actually vice chair of something called the Peer Workforce Development Initiative, and we're developing trainings, we're putting together a peer specialist certification, and working on initiatives to help to build out the workforce and give them the training they need to fill all the different roles in the state involving peer support, including the crisis response model. Obviously, extra complexity. You add a third player, and a peer support worker. By definition, there's no cure for mental health conditions, as you all are aware. So a peer support worker does require, the availability of specialized support. For example, we call it co-reflection, which gives workers an opportunity to process with other peers and peer managers what they do. So that's just in a nutshell some of the challenges and risk. And maybe I'll stop there to see if anybody has any questions or before I move on, or.
Yeah, go ahead.
You sure?
Yeah.
Okay. I think you kind of answered it. You said that you're part of a group developing some kind of standardization for training for peer support
Yes.
workers. Are there, that you know of, are there any other standards elsewhere for such trainings, or?
Well, it's interesting. We here in Vermont like to think, when it comes to socially progressive things or bleeding edge, that we're ahead of the pack. 43 states have what's called a peer specialist certification. We do not. And that's one of the major initiatives that the legislature has, last year they approved conceptually, and this year we're working on a legislative strategy for this session to get funding for that, and we have some other initiatives. And many places, many of the places across the country have had these programs for a number of years, and so the bad news is we don't have it. The good news is we have a lot of models and a lot of states that have been doing it for quite a while, so that we have something to build upon. We don't have to start from scratch, but that's a great question.
I feel like that's similar to my question too, because I'm more familiar with recovery coaching for substance use disorder.
Yeah.
So that's been my experience, and I see the value in that. So I'm very biased towards this. I think this is absolutely
Yeah.
amazing, and I adore what you're doing, and I'm so excited. But that was going to be my question. Like in Vermont, I'm on the certification board for Recovery Vermont for recovery coach certification,
Yeah.
which is very new right now.
Right.
But that was going to be my question: is do you have a specific certification process in the state?
Right.
And then I saw that SAMHSA was up, the Substance Abuse Mental Health System Administration. Is that funding right now what you're doing, or what does that funding source look like?
I'll get to that later.
Okay.
Excellent question. It's
Okay.
at the end of my presentation.
Okay, I'll jump ahead, thank you.
But your point, recovery coaching is a great example. Sam, could probably explain this or has in the past, but just to reiterate, in this state, when it comes to funding, whether it's from the federal government or locally or within the state, it tends to go into two different buckets, a mental health bucket and a substance use bucket. And initiatives tend to kind of be siloed in that way, unfortunately. And when it comes to the peer support model, the substance use community is ahead of the mental health community by having recovery coaches, by having recovery coaching certification. And that's one of the things that we're trying to do is learn from what's going on the recovery coaches side, and at the same time try to work to better and better collaborate, because we all should be working together, not kind of doing our little thing in one silo and doing our little thing in the other. But yeah, so that's an excellent question as well. Recovery coaching is a peer support model.
Exactly.
For sure.
yeah.
I would just throw out that I think that's true in the adult world. I'm not sure that that is the same case in the children's system of care.
In terms of?
The substance abuse and recovery coaching, I think when we talk about prevention and getting upstream and being proactive, I think that there is a lot of opportunity to improve that. I'm actually the children's director at our local DA,
Right.
and so there's been a lot of work around this. And there's a lot of historical reasons why I think the substance abuse and DMH, their fundings have been separate.
Right.
Pros and cons, but I do think, especially when we're talking about crisis, I also think that's, the mom's letter really resonated with me that I think in children's mental health crisis, when a child goes into crisis, it looks very different than an adult does.
Right.
And so challenging us to look at both lenses of how we create a system to support both.
Right. So are you saying that, you said children are different than adult in this arena?
I think there's very limited resources for youth who are experiencing substance abuse issues.
Right.
Our budget, we received $40,000 to address substance abuse issues in Franklin and Grand Isle.
I myself, I'm on the Adult State Stroke Program Standing Committee and also the SAMHSA Block Grant Planning Council. So I have tended to focus on the adult side, but I have colleagues who are strategic partners who are specifically also on the Children's Adult Standing Committee, as well as other focused on another initiatives. And the big one, which probably everybody in this room is well aware of, is children and adult stays in the emergency department. That's a huge issue that we're together trying to collaborate to find solutions. And it's a system-wide issue. It's not just, you can go to one problem or one, a provider or or a DA, designated agency. So yeah, it's a knotty issue, and with children, it's definitely even further down the curve in the negative way. So I totally agree with that.
I just wonder, as you're exploring the peer model, again, I think Children's has a lot of work to do around that, but there is the Vermont Family Network and there's the Federation for Families.
Right.
But that, might be nice to do, to look at this holistically and pull them in, because we've tried to recruit for peer support for years, and we've had a real problem getting families that want to do that work, and we have money available to help them. So I just kind of throw that out there, just as.
And you said you work for NCSS?
I'm the children's director there.
The children's
I'm also
director.
the chair of the.
In the CRT,
No,
AOP, or?
so CRT is adult services, so I'm birth to 22.
Adult, yeah,
Yep.
right.
And we're also the preferred provider for adolescent substance abuse in Franklin and Grand Isle.
Okay. Yeah, again, my colleagues that focus on the children's side are also, they include Pam McCarthy and the folks on the Family Network as well.
Yep.
That's
great.
The other one you mentioned. I have problems sometimes with acronyms that just.
There's a ton of them.
Could you tell me, you said a problem recruiting, I'm just taking notes here.
Peer workers,
Peer
so
workers.
we try to have a peer worker for any family that comes into children's mental health to help them navigate the system, because it's really complex and there's a lot of acronyms and there's a lot of different types of meetings. And so try to have an adult that can do that. And we've recruited for that position for 3 or 4 years now. And we had one person that began the job and it just wasn't a good match. And so we've had a real issue recruiting people to do that. And I think there's a lot, I have a children's standing committee, and I would love to have more adults, our parents that have received services that could give feedback, but I have a real hard time getting people to attend.
We're in active discussions with Lamoille County Mental Health and Washington County Mental Health regarding peer support, recruiting,
Thank
and
you.
issues. So, if you'd like to follow up with that later,
Okay.
sometime in the future, I'd love to have a conversation around that. So anyway, so that's the benefits, challenges, and risks. In the interest of time, I'm going to move through some of this quickly. I was going to sort of recap my understanding of what's going on here, but I don't think I'll spend time doing that. You all have to, I guess, just trust me that I understand some of the great work that Sam has been doing, that Chief Lamothe has led in the state, and it really is admirable, and kudos to this town and to the leadership for what you've done in moving the ball down the field. So moving right along then, I think I'm just gonna forge ahead so we can get to the meat of this. So the keys to success in building the crisis response triad. First and foremost, and I can't emphasize more strongly, that collaboration is one of the most fundamental keys. Is having the police department here, the designated agency, and the peer support entity working together as equals, and trying to solve the problem and figure out how to find the right mix and the right process that's going to work for each, in this case for St. Albans, and that fits into the broader context of, this part of the state and the state overall. Other keys to success, is having a strong peer support entity, and by that I mean a peer-run, peer-staffed organization like, Pathways Vermont is one of my employers, many employers. I'm a true Vermonter. I have 3, 4 jobs, very part-time. But so having a strong peer support entity. Right now in the state, we have some very, very good peer-run organizations, Vermont Psychiatric Survivors, Pathways, but we don't have enough. And so that's an area that we're working on, initiatives to try to build our capacity. Having a trained workforce, having enough and adequately trained, more than adequately trained, but successfully trained for this particular type of work, because not everybody can do, not every peer support worker can be a crisis peer support worker. It really, requires someone who's at a pretty far along place in their recovery and also has like you, an embedded social worker. Not all social workers could do what you do. You have a highly specialized role, and it requires a specialized person like yourself, Sam, to do what you do. And it's the same for us peers. Training, obviously, critical, and funding. And I'll talk about that later. I'll eventually get to your question. Trust me, I'll get there. So moving right along, just to reinforce, the team here is the police department, NCSS, and a peer support, a peer-run agency. So just quickly, who we are, I told you about what services we are, our mission, vision. I'll share this with you. I would just ask, if I share it, that it not go out, whoever receives it, please distribute it, and it is proprietary. That way I don't have to go through every slide and you can read them later.
Yes.
In terms of my business experience, I spent 35 years as a management consulting and executive corporate finance in Connecticut, but my mental health condition reached a point years ago where I just could no longer function, so I ended up basically retiring and moving to Vermont. In mental health, I guess I talked about my experience, but essentially I'm a mental health peer support advocate, worker, and volunteer. So I wear a lot of different hats when it comes to mostly peer support related stuff. Law enforcement, I talked about that. I just recently went to Team 2 training. Is everybody familiar with Team 2? You've been to it, Sam? Isn't it great? I thought it was a fabulous day. An opportunity for law enforcement, for clinicians, the ADAs, the prosecutors, and then peers like myself to collaborate and learn from each other. So moving right along, in addition to myself, Lisa, we have a number of strategic partners. I'm not going to go through them individually, but I mentioned Fox. He and I are working very closely together, and some of you may know Ann Donahue, who is the Vice Chair of the House Healthcare Committee. She and I are, along with the last person on the list, Ward Nile, have been working very closely together on a number of advocacy initiatives. And you may know Ward because he's the children's gentleman I mentioned earlier.
Yep.
And he's connected with the folks you know. So basically, we're a lean organization, and I should also mention that Michael Walker is a very close friend of mine, but he also happens to have run a national public sector consulting firm and done law enforcement assignments for over 30 years. So he has very deep expertise in law enforcement in doing this type of process improvement consulting. So the project plan. And again, we're very much in the early stages across the country in this. So this is a conceptual plan for us to start a dialogue around. It's not a, here's the menu, order what you have off, and then you have your meal and move on. This is like we have to create the restaurant and figure out what we're going to put on the menu. But essentially, the overall concept is to create there's two phases. The first phase one is to set up a CRT, crisis response triad, planning and implementation team. And what we would do is provide the facilitation and the things that are needed to help with that collaboration and other activities, which I'll talk to in a minute. So conceptually, the plan would be to pull together a team to both put together the plan and then actually implement the plan. A part of that would be to do a needs assessment, and the needs assessment would include things like looking at evidence-based best practices, workforce systems capacity, training, looking for opportunities for interstate collaboration, multi-payer collaboration, just the whole, set of issues that one does when they're doing a comprehensive needs assessment. And the objective, one of the main objectives of phase one is to actually create the implementation plan. So the next piece, to finally get to the question you asked. And what was your name again?
Melinda White.
Yeah, Melinda, your question. Part of phase one is to create a funding strategy. And what I have here is basically the 4 buckets of potential funding for, well, not only peer support, crisis response, but basically any initiative in the mental health space. But in the case of your city, the initial target would be Department of Mental Health and the city of St. Albans. So, and then secondarily, looking into the funding that's available from the Department of Public Safety, and then further down the road, starting to tap foundations and philanthropists. Like Prince Harry has a foundation, and which does things in the mental health space, but they've got a particular slant. Unfortunately, peer support doesn't fit under that. But so that's sort of down the road, is tapping those sort of funders. But the immediate funding pools would be Department of Mental Health and the city coffers. So just to drill down a little bit on the Department of Mental Health, as I mentioned, I sit on the SAMHSA Block Grant Planning Council, and prior to COVID, Vermont got about $1 million a year in the block grant. And then what our committee would do is we'd look at our priorities and we'd make recommendations to the commissioner of DMH as to where we think the priorities are, where the money should go. Now, since COVID started, the spigot has just opened. And DMH is basically drinking out of a fire hose right now. We have just within the block grant and some related fundings, we have upwards of 8 to 9 million now, and that doesn't account. That's just on the mental health side. That doesn't account funding on the substance abuse side. So the position that DMH is in, very, very justifiably, is they have these funds. Some of it's ARPA funds, it's but just to simplify, there's 8 to 10 million at least of funds that are focused on specifically mental health, and DMH is doing everything it can to try to find the right opportunities, the right entities, the right initiatives to put that money out to. And part of what we do in the first, I've been having conversations with them about, how can we outside of DMH help you give us money?
Yeah.
And the process is basically to draft a one-page concept proposal to say, here's what we'd like to pursue funding for. My contact, who's the Trish Singer, you may know, she, among other things, she's a psychiatrist and one of the senior people there. Among other things, she oversees all the peer support related things. And a number of conversations with her. And she said, if we can get concept documents into her hand, into DMH's hands, circulate them to the right people, and get feedback that yes, this is a very viable project, then the next step would be to put together a full proposal that would be done, and in the case of what I'm talking to you about today, it would be working on that collaboratively with the planning and implementation team. So phase two assumes we've secured the funding, or at least identified and have it earmarked. And with that funding, we would basically go and implement the plan. And what Parker Advisors, as well as our strategic partners, would do is help, again, be sort of the facilitator and work with DMH, which, like any state agency, can be fun, among other things. But, yeah, and in terms of your committee, to provide you with some very specific feedback or very specific recommendation to think about. Of the, I don't know how, I don't know if we had 25 or 30 or 35 different recommendations. This is one of the recommendations, which was, and we had a lot of discussion, we went back and forth over months, and we came up with the notion that recommending 1.5 FTEs for a crisis worker position. And the idea is it would be a combination, because right now, Montpelier has a half FTE, so half of Sous-le-Maire's time. So the idea is to add an additional 1.5, so we'd be up to 2 mental health specialists. And that would be a combination of peer support workers and social workers from, in this case, Washington County Mental Health. And the Washington County would cover the social worker side, and the qualified mental health services entity, in this case, is a crisis drop-in center in Montpelier called Another Way, which is an analog, if you're familiar, in Burlington with Pathways Vermont Community Center. It's essentially the same thing. And Another Way. So essentially collaboratively work together to find the right mix and the right process for crisis response and case management. So this is something that there's no confidentiality regarding this side. You know, if you're interested, in, I don't know, I haven't seen any of your working documents or materials. I don't know, how far along or what you've discussed specifically. But this will give you an example of what we came up with and what successfully was agreed upon by City Council. Of course, they haven't said they'd fund it, how much they'd fund yet, but that's to be determined. But there is 2 of the members of the police response, the Montpelier committee, are city councilors. So we have 2 people who are integrally involved in these discussions and who are on the board. And one happens to be, you may be aware, Jack McCullough, who runs the Mental Health Law Project for Vermont Legal Aid, a very strong, huge mental health advocate. So, yeah, so we have a lot of momentum and support for moving this again down the field. Sorry for all the football analogies, I'm just a diehard. I won't say what team, but it's somewhere in New England. So, next steps.
Not what you're all thinking, though.
What?
I said not what they're all thinking, though.
Oops.
When he opens it up for questions, I'll have to.
Yeah, right. Okay, well, so we've reached the end of my presentation, and it's really a series of questions at this point. And I guess this is really just opening the floor for discussion and questions. And some of the things is, in terms of moving forward, what's the process in the city for deciding and presenting recommendations to City Council? I think I had read December. You're
Yes.
supposed to be making your recommendations, so how many days away?
Yeah, coming very.
Within the next month and a half. Or if you're like us, our original deadline was June 30th. We didn't get it done until October 30th, so a little bit behind the curve. But I'm sure all of you are volunteers,
Correct.
yeah, as we were too. So, And as we all have found out, this is a huge lift, doing a project like this. And kudos to everybody in this room who's part of the committee for volunteering and putting all the time into it. It's really important work. It can be very thankless for all the time and effort. And sometimes even worse than thankless, you can get grief from people because not everyone is of like mind, as we all are well aware. And in mental health and crisis response, there are very different opinions. So what's the process here? What can I do in the very near term to support this? And then I was hoping by the time Lisa and I are finished, we agree upon what the next steps are. And I have been having a few conversations with Chief Lamont, and it's not only is he delightful to work with, but his background, between all the years he was at the state police with the embedded soldier, he's got a degree in psychology and just a progressive thinker. You're very fortunate to have somebody, and we are too in Montpelier. Chief Pete has just been a delight to work with, and I've already started this process that we talked about with him in Montpelier. So with that, the floor is open for questions, and then hopefully by the end, some suggestions about what we do next.
I think the first question I would have on the previous slide where you were asking specifically for a 1.5 FTE. And what does that look like is it full-time? And you said you already had a 1.5 FTE on staff. So you basically wanted two positions. So it'd be one full-time peer worker and then one full-time embedded crisis worker or social worker?
That's the concept. But again, this is something that's got to be, that we're really stressing that it's a collaboration to figure out what works best. It's not your turf and my turf. I want to get as much money from my side and the other. And so that's why we, with all the debate and discussion, we ended up where we did, to say we want to add 1.5 mental health specialists. And we're going to work to figure out how that falls out between the two. I mean, myself, I would like to see 1.5 peer support crisis workers, if I could make the decision. But that's not, we'll have to see. But ideally, yes. Ideally, I think having a crisis, an existing embedded social worker and a peer support worker working together, I think would be, in many ways, that's sort of the best next step. And certainly put in Montpelier or St. Albans, if they get that move forward, ahead of the curve in terms of moving in this direction.
Did you, when you were making this recommendation to Montpelier City Council, did you have dollars associated with those 1.5 FTEs, or did you just say, we think this is going to cost approximately $10 million, and then?
The city council, the police, we called it the Montpelier Police Review Committee. The review committee did not, some of the initiatives we were able to come up with dollar amounts for. Most either didn't impact the budget, they were not, didn't require additional funding, and others were just like, we have no idea, but we're going to work on it. We did not have a dollar amount in our recommendation, but again, Chief Pete, the progressive thinker, he reached out to Washington County to just kind of size it. And I think the latest number was in the neighborhood of about 140 or 150,000, and that's sort of the Washington County, the designated agency take on 1.5 FTE. So, but maybe that gives you a ballpark to think of. I can't validate that number, from my side of things, and it was just kind of like, asking Washington County, can you give us a sense? But I would say 100 to 150 is, based on really very limited information, is kind of a ballpark. budget number to think of in terms of the 1.5 mental health specialists.
And I guess that's great information. I think my question was more process oriented. Was there a need to have those dollars before the pitch was made to city council? Did they come back and say, great, tell us how much it's gonna cost, or
No.
you were just able to make this?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they accepted our proposal without the budget, without any budget number attached. But between the October and the November city council, the Montpelier chief Pete, did some sort of initial legwork to get a sense.
Okay.
And, so that was not initially part of our recommendation.
Okay.
And I feel like I understood the answer, but just want to make sure I'm really clear. So in that recommendation, you didn't specify in detail which position would have how much. This was just kind of the
No.
ask, and then
Right.
we learn it. Okay, that's helpful to know too, because I think that's something, well, I know it's something we've talked about, are we necessarily looking for another duplicate position of the one that's created already, or a different position that could accent work together with?
Right.
And that's the piece that I think tonight, we'll talk through and try to figure out what that's gonna look like. But it's helpful to hear that you're not really getting super specific, or you didn't get too specific in talking to city council.
Right.
You were just very clear that we
Right.
know that there's at least 1.5 FTE needed to answer the call, at least a little more. I'm sure you probably could use many more, but just to
Right.
say, okay, so that helps to get an idea of how fine the detail.
Yeah, and I tend to be an optimist, maybe sometimes a little bit too optimistic, but when it comes to the funding thing, I shouldn't make commitments or even directionally, but I truly believe that the funding that's available from the Department of Mental Health will be available for initiatives like this. It's just a case of going through the steps that one needs to go through and doing it in a timely way, because it's a limited, a lot of this is like one-time COVID-related funding, and has different time horizons that when it, 6 months or 2 years or 3 years when it has to be spent. So we have sort of this little silver lining to our COVID situation, in that there's funding available now that may never be available to getting new initiatives up and running, and sort of putting them in place and doing some pilots and doing proof of concept to make sure, yes, this makes sense, yes, it's good for the community, and yes, we can do it cost effectively.
My understanding from that, and they're trying not to push it, but there is a piece because of the funding tied to that around sustainability and what happens once the dollars do go away, because I think we always get stuck in that place of a community receives this great opportunity and then you pull it away, and DMH probably does not want to have that hanging over them, and so just kind of throwing that out there.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it depends on who you talk to, because you can't always build things out of sustainability, you just have to do it.
Excuse me?
So you can't always just build things out of sustainability, because it's not realistic, it's just sometimes you just have to do it, but
Right.
that's been part of the state conversation.
Yeah, that's a great point. That, part of this process is about, being cognizant that it's fine to have funding for initiatives and pilots and doing planning, but unless you can figure out how you're going to fund that going forward, then you're kind of creating a bridge to nowhere.
Or if you can show the cost savings, that sometimes is appealing as well. To your point in the beginning of the presentation around the number of calls and data,
Right.
and saying that just will be funneled through a different mechanism, and that you'd be saving the state these dollars
Yeah.
in some capacity.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point, because, part of, whether it's an embedded social worker or a peer or crisis worker, if it implemented properly, and I'm preaching to the choir here, it saves money. Keeping people out of the ED, keeping people out of the inpatient, getting people out of them quickly, not having the children sitting in ED, by having, ways of dealing with mental health situations like crises with, arguably, more effective and certainly more cost-effective ways to use community supports as opposed to you know, the more institutional, more carcerative options that unfortunately we as a country, you know, have had to lean on because, you know, we haven't developed the outside sources to alleviate.
And I think of like, even with SAMHSA grants, the funding and that piece, I think once, like you said, you kind of get it off the ground and show the data that proves how effective and efficient it is, that can be helpful in applying for other funds. Because I know that we did that with the Vermont Recovery Network. I was on that board of directors for a while, and there's 12 recovery centers in the state of Vermont, and the goal was to get recovery coaches embedded with the police departments, with the hospitals. And ours is locally, the last hospital, that pilot starts, or not pilot, but that position starts in December of this year, which is exciting, getting recovery coaches, and this is for substance use, but it's just to say that, you know, once that work is happening, it usually starts filtering across the state, similar to what Chief Lamont did when he was lieutenant, and having that position embedded with VSP and showing the efficacy, and now it's something that's supported across the state. So
Right.
I definitely applaud what you're doing, because I so believe in that work, and I know it's long hours, and it's very patiently awaiting for each piece of the state to buy in and trust, and then see the results, and, you know, then question, why didn't we do this sooner? So I am grateful that you came to our neck of the woods to talk to us about it, because I have heard in Montpelier, multiple meetings about the mental health peer program, but I'm just not as informed on that piece of it compared to the substance use. So this has been extremely helpful and informative.
Yeah, oh, good. I'm glad it's helpful.
Yeah, definitely.
I just have one thing, so Dan and I had several lengthy conversations before all this, so I appreciate you coming up, especially on short notice of getting this meeting set up in the last couple of weeks when we started talking about actually meeting. Real quick, 'cause this question wasn't asked by anybody in the group, you and I have talked about it, I just want to get out there though, what would you think is a realistic timeline to get something in place? Because I know that's going to be something that's going to have to be talked about at some point, but what would you think? And at least I know you and I have talked about it, but nobody in here has asked the question.
You had to ask the tough question. Didn't I tell you not to ask that question? No.
Just put it in brackets, I mean, what do you think a realistic bracket is?
Well,
So it took Montpelier how long?
what?
It took Montpelier how long
To get the embedded social worker?
to get to the recommendation part?
It took us a year, basically, to get to the recommendation. But which is.
Even beyond recommendation, let's say where you are right now in Montpelier, you made recommendation, we make it in December, whatever that, what do you think from then on, from your business to get somebody in place, what do you think a realistic timeline is?
Well, you know, when we're talking about state agencies, whether it's DMH or the designated agencies, I spent 35 years in the private sector, so. I don't know, just to throw a number out, if everything fell in place, maybe, I don't want to say a year, it's probably more like 2 years. If you have the funding and everyone works together, but maybe, 1 to 3 years.
And I appreciate that answer, because that's what I was thinking in my head too, is a couple of years.
Yeah.
Based on our conversations, and just to everybody gets an idea on that, it took us a long time to get Nick in place for you have to use Nick instead of Sam, because that was the first one we got in place. This stuff takes time. All the intentions are great, it takes time.
Yeah.
And so I don't think that's unrealistic at all. I just wanted to put that out there so everyone
Yeah.
understands. It's not like we make decisions tonight and by January we have somebody sitting in.
Yeah, right.
Right.
So no, I appreciate that. Just a couple other things I wanted to clarify. When you said 140 to 150,000, was that for the 1.5 positions in total?
Yeah.
So that's very accurate. So I know what VSP is paying per position to each designated agency, and that's 1/2 of them is about 140,000. So that would be an accurate number.
Based on just on a clinical social.
Yeah, so I think-
And that's where the number came from, was from.
Yeah, so I think we would get the same fee. Sustainability, that's a great point, because, if we get the COVID money, I know the city and is hesitant to use COVID money on a lot of things because of the sustainability part. You get that one-time help and then it's gone, so that would be a question we have. And lastly is the savings. Yeah, you do get the savings. I know that the state is feeling some savings and Northwestern Medical Center is feeling savings for work that Sam does, but your stakeholders don't necessarily feel that savings if they're kicking in the money. What's the savings to them?
Right.
You have to look selfishly on that.
Right.
So I'm just throwing those out there, things to consider when you're talking about all this, who's gonna pay and what is direct savings to St. Albans City? If people don't go to Northwestern Medical Center, yeah, that's great for the grand scheme, but what is the direct savings to them? We have to look on what the benefits to the population we serve, so.
Right.
That's all I got.
Yeah.
I really appreciate you coming. I think it was great. I learned a lot. We've had great conversations. I think this is a great program.
Yeah.
And I support it 100%. I just want everybody to.
Yeah, and in terms of the probability of success and timeframe, what we have work, in addition to this, big pot of, one-time funding, we also have the AHS initiative I talked about, and they're gonna hire somebody, it may not be my team, but they're gonna move forward on putting together a plan, and what you're doing here now would be incorporated as well as this initiative, and then we have Fox, who's also on the team, so to speak, so it's not just St. Albans or Dan, Parker Advisors, Lisa and I working with you, we've got, there's a lot of momentum and players who have a vested interest in making this work and finding ways to make it sustainable, not just do a few little pilots and say, wow, those are cool, but actually to, do something meaningful that will stand the test of time and be funded for the test of time.
I think it's like everything else with these positions. Once you get one going and two going, the more you get going, the more this is going to sustain itself. You're going to get the help from the bigger agencies, being Department of Public Safety. That's, but it takes time to get the first one up and running.
Right. Yeah.
It's way spent for 7 years getting all these positions going.
7 years.
It took 7 years from the time we got Nick going to get the rest of the barracks for them. That's kind of
Yeah.
what I use for my steps, to see how long it took for that to get going. That's my parameter.
That makes sense too, because the recovery coaching, like in the EDs and in the police departments, that was about 8-ish years ago when I was advocating to, like a number of people were advocating, and now it's about 8 years later in the last hospital in the state that doesn't have it is starting, so it is about.
I think Nick hit the 7th year this year, I think, and that's how long, like I said, from the first one to 10th.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
So, yeah, takes time.
In some ways, though, I feel like community-wise, we've turned a corner, though, right?
Yes.
Whereas some of this would have been, because I watched that evolution happen over the years, and so but it has taken a long time, I think, just to turn that corner. And some of this is not gonna be like money in somebody's pocket, right? But the lagging indicator, these are the things that communities do that make people want to come and live in our community, right? And then that's our economy. And none of that is definitive, and you can't, but that should be our goal, right? All the reason that we're here, the reasons that we're trying to do this work, we're doing it at the hospital, is to make this be a place where people feel safe. And this is, going back to how we opened with that story, right? Like that is a family that maybe doesn't necessarily feel safe in our community right now, right? So how do we help bridge that gap, knowing that it won't be tomorrow? I totally appreciate that, but I think it goes a long way just to even make the recommendation and then have it move forward if that's the way we go.
So,
Nobody on there.
so what would you all say, Chief and the committee, would be your next step relative to this idea of layering, collaborative layering and some peer support of the crisis?
I think that's a lot of what, we had brought up in the last meeting and then tonight too in executive session, because I really would love to tease that out from each individual person,
Right,
get
you
people's
guys thought
thoughts
that ahead.
on the idea of doing that layering of services as opposed to just trying to double up on one. And I think there's pros and cons for both.
Right.
So I've heard, the way that Chief Lamont has often said, well, I'm not a professional and everything, but I know the right people. So same for me, I feel like, well, I'm not a professional in this area, but I feel like with the collective thoughts of everybody together might help us come to a better direction on what would in doing the recommendation, what would the ask be? Would it be for looking at a different position than what's already in place? Would it be adding more to the one, and I personally prefer having the three-legged stool where you've got something a little bit different. So you've got the partner of the embedded crisis worker in addition to the peer worker, but I also am familiar with my biases because I do a lot of training around that, and I'm a huge supporter of peer services, especially being a peer recovery coach myself, that I know how it benefited me in the beginning, so
Right.
I'm kind of biased in that way, so that's why I really would love to get everybody's thoughts, because I love adding something new, especially new to this community, and knowing many of the players in this community, many of the people that are in those, like, in working with individuals in crisis often, how critical this service is, not just embedded in law enforcement, but I think embedded in many partners in Franklin Grand Isle County. So, as I said, I know I'm biased, I know what I would like to vote for, but I also know that there's gonna be different views that I need to hear that will probably help bring us to a balance. So that's my thoughts. I would love for anybody else who wants to share.
Melinda, are you talking about kind of adding substance use, peer support into this?
Well, I've been wanting to do that for years,
Yeah.
but specifically with tonight, more talking about the mental health peer support that was shown tonight. So that's kind of what I'm looking at. And yeah, I was just bringing up the reason that I am so convinced of this model, even though this one's mental health, is because of my personal and professional experience with the substance use peer recovery coaches and seeing the efficacy of that over the last 8-9 years. And knowing that it takes time for that to finally take. But once there's the visibility on it, the quality of that care and that connection tends to be very long-lasting because there's credibility almost immediately, meeting with a peer that you feel like, okay, they get it. So I love the idea of, if we're talking solely about mental health, getting a mental health worker. In my perfect world, I think we need both. I think we need a
The peer
licensed
support,
clinician,
okay.
yeah, we need a LADAC or an LADC embedded with law enforcement, as well as a peer recovery coach, but I'm
Yeah.
trying to
Yeah.
start
Yeah.
some
Yeah,
things.
I don't, yeah, I mean, I think that's a given. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't think that's something that can be left out of the equation or the
Mhm.
project. I just wasn't sure if you were talking about somebody specifically trained with substance use, that peer, the peer support people having that background as well.
It would be, I think, helpful, for sure. And I think that's another thing for us as a board to decide, because I think that we've talked a lot about the mental health piece, because there's already an embedded service with mental health. But again, I've been that biased voice at every possible community partnership for anybody who works with me, who keeps saying, where's the substance
Yeah.
use disorder
That's what I'm
professionals?
asking, yeah.
Where's that? And I know that there's other, I think part of that's gonna be us, kind of seeking that out and being supportive as a community, because I do know that there is SAMHSA funding available to grow that work. There's a number of areas, Project Vision in Rutland and Springfield, I mean, there's a number of areas that have had recovery coaches forever in there, and embedded, and I also think it's a community commitment, similar to this, it's a community commitment to try to get, we're trying to start more realistic that we would love to have 5 positions embedded, and yet it's like, okay, well, if we could focus on like 1, maybe 2, and it's not both full-time, what would that look like? And that's where, getting.
No, I agree, I
Just thoughts.
was just trying to clarify what you were
Yeah.
saying.
Yeah. 2 points. I very strongly believe that in the three-legged stool, and would love to get to a four-legged table where substance abuse is
Well, yeah,
the
I mean,
fourth.
do we go for
That's
the
a really
four-legged?
strong foundation.
Right.
But I also strongly believe that it has to be evolutionary. And I think the path that we're on, adding a clinician, a social worker, is the first step. And then adding peer. I would not personally recommend only having a peer worker
Oh, no.
working with police.
No, I
'cause
wasn't.
for a variety of reasons, including, the mental health services and having the connections and the follow-up. It just doesn't make sense to me to do it, the process that way.
No, I wasn't saying
Yeah,
that.
and to layer in the substance abuse piece. Of course, the peer support specialists, and you, I'm sure, Sam, have some level of SUD, substance use disorder
Oh.
training. That's a component, but certainly not as strong as, a recovery coach or someone who is a professional in that discipline.
No, I was really just advocating to add that, not to take away, not to have a
Right.
clinician or anything like
Exactly.
that, but to add that to the to the project. or
Well, at
to the
any
mix.
rate, aren't we at 50% dual diagnosis anyway?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Or more.
excellent point,
Absolutely.
Lisa,
Mhm.
excellent point.
Which is why it's even that much more critical to work together.
Right.
Because there's
Exactly.
that, depending on where you go, sometimes there's the conflict of, which one do I treat first? And the reality is, you treat both. Period, end of story, but that's not always sometimes the approach. So having partners together can bring a better outcome too.
Exactly.
So I guess what are you looking for from us? I mean, we so appreciate you came and did this presentation. We know you've been in conversations with Chief, but I guess looking at both of you, what are you looking for specifically from us?
This, for me, this was more for you.
No, it's for you, no, it's for you.
And so the vicious
I know
circle.
that you were going to go to the city council in December.
Yeah.
And if you had pushed that back, I suggest that you do that so you should be ready to go. But you do it at whatever time frame works for you. But this was something I had been thinking about for a while. I ran into Wilda White. I don't know if you know who Wilda White is. I've been on committees with her, the governor's committee for a while. And her and I were talking about peers several months ago, and I've been on a committee with, or a panel with Dan, I think it was made by NAMI committee or something,
NAMI,
or
yeah.
something. I'm a Team 2 trainer myself, and so just conversations started happening, and then time got crunched, and I was like, oh, we gotta get him here, and this was just an avenue I was thinking about pursuing. And then I realized you were gonna go in front of the city council, so just revved it up to get it closer. I just wanted you to have all the things that I'm thinking about that you know about. So I didn't want you to go in front of the committee, the council, and say, hey, we want to get another SAM, which I would completely support, without knowing that this existed as well, because this is just as beneficial, or as beneficial as just another avenue. So I wanted you to have everything in your pocket. So you may get one shot at the city council right now, so
Yeah.
Yeah.
you might want to have everything, all your knowledge you can get. So
Yeah.
I know what's out there. I've been around this stuff a little while, so just wanted you to have the knowledge I have. And I didn't hear everything. Dan had brought some stuff tonight that I hadn't heard before, so.
I'd like to follow on to that and be really honest and frank about this issue of, who's going to do what.
Yep.
The system, whether it's the hospitals, and I don't mean offense to anybody, but I'm just going to tell you my perspective. The establishment, whether it's the provider, UVM and the other hospital, or the designated agency system, has the funding and has the power and the establishment. The peer support community is much smaller and barely funded.
Yeah.
So when we get involved in an issue, a lot of times, and an example was, we do work, Ward and Donahue and I have been doing work with these various ED initiatives. There's one here in Southwest and CBMC and down. And so often, we find that they invite us to the table and they say, oh, we have peer support here. And then at the end of the day, the decisions and the money goes to the establishment players, not the new initiative players like peer support. So I just want to be transparent and give you my perspective about, what myself as an advocate and my colleagues have dealt with. That, it's a heavy lift, trying to be kind of a newer, smaller David working against the larger player. I hope that doesn't.
No, it doesn't offend me. I think the adult system of care and the children's is very different.
Yeah. And I think Washington County's, I used to be a client of theirs, and they do a great job. And I remember my family worked for the Howard Center for years, so I have a very high opinion of the system. I'm just giving you the perspective.
Yeah, absolutely.
The peer piece.
Familiar with that one
Sure.
too. I'm very familiar.
It's very difficult to be a peer. I mean, I was on that committee too with
Yeah.
Central Vermont redesign. I was speaking to my experience in the emergency room. I don't know if you're aware, at Central Vermont, it's like a jail. They call it the TCA, but it's like jail. It's very degrading. And I was speaking to that, and someone on the committee, I don't even know what his job position was, he just yelled out, "Can we get back to the point?"
Right.
So it's really hard to be heard. It's just really hard to be heard.
I have maybe a question I could have asked earlier. In your peer support model, who in theory would be, or what does the model look like to provide some sort of clinical supervision for the individuals that could potentially be in this position? What's built into your structure that would give them a higher up, as it were, or somebody to check in with within the peer support network? Is that a designated individual from your agency or your company in theory?
No, it would be one of the existing peer support agencies. Like, you're hired, your funding comes from the city, or your,
No.
comes from somewhere. Not, but you were hired, and you have a super.
No, I'm just kidding.
Don't go there, Dan. No, I guess I just wanted to point out that you work for NCSS, and they hire you and they pay you and supervise you. The same, it would be exactly the same on the peer side. A peer support entity like Pathways or another way would hire, would recruit, hire, train, supervise, provide, the specialized, code reflection, we call it, that I get as a peer support worker from Pathways and from NAMI. So it would be using, the current providers of peer support services, or there are a number of folks that are talking about launching some new, new players and getting some more, organizational, strength or capacity. So, we talked beyond our time on the agenda. I guess what I'd say is that in the near term, if there's anything I can provide to the committee that would be helpful to you as you finish up your process, share with you whatever I'm able, from Montpelier or my own perspective, I'd be delighted to do that. And in terms of next steps beyond that, would I continue to work with Chief Vermont, or would be another individual, or how?
You can go through me, whatever you want to do.
Yeah, I mean, because I know that there's going to be follow-up questions, I'm sure, that'll come up, so definitely if you're comfortable sharing your contact information with Chief Lamont, and then if he can share that with us, that'd be great.
Okay.
And then I'll try to funnel any additional questions that come up after the fact that we may not have thought of and whatnot, and even on a separate level, I'm just really interested in that work and learning more about it, because what I do for my job, so, I'm most grateful for you coming, taking the time to share this with us. I think it was huge.
Sure.
Gave us a lot of perspective. Did any other board members have any other questions? Any other thoughts? Before we move on?
Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks again.
Thank you very much.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you for giving the opportunity to talk about peer support. It's something you can tell probably I love to do.
I can identify with that too, and I love it.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'll get your email directly to Melinda.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, no, feel free.